This video will be a refutation of Tariq Nasheed's claims in Hidden Colors. The following clip claims that the Egyptians were Negroes. This is not true. Here's the clip from Hidden Colors 3.
One way the white supremacists have been able to dominate and subjugate melanated people around the planet is by controlling the education, by controlling the knowledge, and controlling the knowledge of history. Because if you don't know yourself, you don't know how to empower yourself. If you don't know your history, you won't know your future. And the white supremacists have been very meticulous in erasing the history of African people and inserting themselves into that history.
The Greeks were the last race of people that the Egyptians passed the arcane knowledge on to. That's where Greek to me came from. They were the last ones that the Egyptians gave that to. It took 3 generations of Greeks under Egyptian rulership that they could finally find one that they could teach.
Now, the Egyptians call their land Kemet, and they use a piece of charcoal, a burnt piece of wood as charcoal, to symbolize what they mean, the blackest black. And all of their carvings of themselves, they paint their skins dark brown or black. They have white paint, red paint, yellow paint, but they paint themselves blacks. How anyone in the world, with so much information available for the public to see, can even be under any illusions that the Egyptian was even light-skinned.
Just when you look at climate and weather, if you go to Egypt, you will notice that the weather is quite hot. And you will notice that it is almost impossible to be able to be outside dressed the way the carvings on the walls are as it relates to the people. Because you would get melanoma before we even knew melanoma existed. So they could not have been depigmented or less pigmented. They have to have been heavily pigmented.
So what we have then is various eyewitness descriptions where people visited Egypt and they left an account of the Egyptians in their texts. So what you have is people like Herodotus, who describes them as black-skinned and woolly-haired. Galen, who describes them as having short, black, dry, and brittle hair.
Not to mention, as Dr. Clark has taught us, where in the world did they do what they did in Africa? He used to say, are you telling me that Eurasians came out of Europe and built Africa up, but never went back to Europe to develop their civilizations the way they did in Africa? Or does it make sense that it was built up in Africa and it was sporadically brought across the globe to China and to Iraq and to Iran and into Europe where you have the Stonehenge? Would that make better sense? So the answer is, there is no question at this point.
Many of the artifacts that are on display in many of the Egyptian collections around the world are fakes.
The Nefertiti statue is of doubtful authenticity. That's a posh way of saying it's almost certainly a fake. A number of scholars have come out quite recently. Henri Sterling in Switzerland, he's come out and said, listen, this is a 100-year forgery.
If there is hundreds of paintings of Nefertiti, and all of them are black, all of the statues in the Cairo Museum of Nefertiti is black. Only this one little white statue in Germany is white. Something's wrong with that picture.
Marx was instructed to use the face of Ludwig's wife, Emily Bouchard. So the face that supposedly was the most beautiful face of ancient history is actually the features of Ludwig Bouchard's wife, Emily Bouchard. So now, that's not even the half of it. Beautiful statue, came out of the ground.
No, it didn't come out of the ground. What happened was Brashad was forced to bring it forward after 11 years. So what did he do? He took the head that Marx made, went back to the Tel Al-Amar site, covered it up with dirt, and came out and had a photo op as if that's how he found it.
To refute the claim that the ancient Egyptians were Negroes, I'll be giving you this video clip here from Keith Thompson of Reformed Apologetics Ministry in his documentary entitled Debunking the Black Hebrew Israelites. It's the best video I've seen on the topic so far, and I think it proves conclusively that the Egyptians were not Negroes, they were not black.
Fake black Israelites claim the ancient Egyptians were Negro, and since the Israelites Moses and Jesus blended in with Egyptians in two biblical stories, they claim the Israelites must have therefore been Negro too. They note in Exodus 2, Moses as a baby is abandoned by his Levite mother, put in a basket in the river, discovered by the daughter of the Egyptian Pharaoh, and then adopted by the Egyptians. Based on the false assumption the ancient Egyptians were Negro, the fake black Israelite writer Elisha Israel thus argues, the daughters of Ruel mistook Moses for an Egyptian. Furthermore, if the Israelites appeared unlike the Egyptians, Moses would have been unable to live among the household of the Pharaoh that sought the death of all the newly born Israelite males, just as Jesus was hidden among the Egyptian population during the days of Herod." End quote. So the question is, were the ancient Egyptians Negroes? Based on examining ancient Egyptian anthropology, mummies, sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions, serious scholars have come to the conclusion the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes. For example, respected Japanese Semitic historian and ancient languages scholar Edwin M. Yamauchi notes, Egyptians accurately depicted their enemies and their allies. They made clear color distinctions between themselves and the black Nubians, whom they rhetorically denounced with insulting epithets. End quote. Indeed, here is ancient Egyptian art showing how Egyptians depicted themselves as light brown-skinned people, compared to how they depicted Nubians or Cushites as black-skinned Negro people. Clearly there is a difference, which proves the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes. The Hamite Cushites were. In other ancient Egyptian art, for example at the tomb of Horemheb, Nubian Negro prisoners are depicted with standard Negro features, such as larger lips and noses, while the Egyptian masters have smaller lips and noses. Moreover, a painting from the tomb of Hui shows Negro Nubians bringing tribute to the Egyptian pharaoh. Egyptians are also in the scene as chariot drivers, and the differences between the Egyptians and Nubian Negroes are clear. Notice the Negroes are darker than the Egyptians, and the Egyptians have long straight hair, which is not a Negro feature. Also, in an ancient Egyptian relief of a Nubian prisoner from the New Kingdom housed in the St. Louis Art Museum, you see how the ancient Egyptians depicted ancient Negro Nubians, and it was not the same as how they depicted themselves. What is more, the wooden chest of Tutankhamun, created between 1417 and 1379 BC, depicts the Egyptian king defeating Cushite Nubians. Clearly the Egyptian king is brown-skinned and not Negro, while the Cushite Nubians were Negroes, being a lot darker. The lips of the Cushite Nubian enemies are fuller as well. All of these depictions demonstrate the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes, and they refute the fake black Israelite appeal to the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary, which denies Ham's son Cush was the progenitor of the Negroes. J. Daniel Hayes concluded that in the delta and northern part of Egypt, the majority of the Egyptians, quote, appeared as they are portrayed in Egyptian art, with straight black hair and light brown skin. Undoubtedly, however, there were other people in the society, both Asiatics and Cushites, who looked different but were nonetheless Egyptians. End quote. Hence this was a mixed society, with the majority being light brown-skinned native Egyptians. In regards to this light brown-skinned majority in ancient Egypt, Professor of Old Testament Robert A. Bennett explains, quote, in terms of the physical and racial characteristics, the Egyptians of the ancient Near East were brown-skinned people with long hair. End quote. Moreover, on this brown-skinned majority, Egyptologist Anne Macy Roth notes, as we know from their observant depictions of foreigners, the ancient Egyptians saw themselves as darker than Asiatics and Libyans, and lighter than the Nubians, Negros, and with different facial features and body types than any of these groups, end quote. Classic scholar Frank Snowden, who is an African-American by the way, notes ancient Egyptians were a lot lighter than black Ethiopians, and also mildly lighter than half-breeds, who lived between Egypt and Ethiopia, quote, those dwelling near the boundaries between Egypt and Ethiopia were not completely black but were half-breeds as to color, in part not so black as Ethiopians, but in part blacker than the Egyptians, end quote. Snowden also notes the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes, but instead they depicted Nubians as Negroes, quote, though not very numerous, the realistic portrayals of blacks in early Egyptian art are sufficient to illustrate the types of Cushites known prior to the New Kingdom, and to show that Nehesu, a word used of Southerners as early as 2300 BC, included peoples with Negroid features, end quote. The 13th century BC Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II reigned during the 19th dynasty. His preserved mummified corpse shows he was not a Negro. As Egyptologist Frank Yurko notes, he is a typical northern Egyptian. He came from the northeasternmost nome of Egypt. He had fine, wavy hair, a prominent hooked nose, and moderately thin lips, end quote. In fact, the mummy of Ramses II shows he had straight, ginger hair. These are not Negro features. We also have the mummy of Thutmose IV, who reigned from 1419 to 1386 BC. He had straight long hair, untypical of ancient and modern Negroes. Now, fake black Israelites often falsely claim the Egyptian Queen Tiye was Negro, based on an ancient sculpture of her head, which they interpret to have an afro. However, that is not an afro, but instead just a kerchief headdress, known as a khat, K-H-A-T. We know this for a fact because we have the actual mummy of this Queen Tiye, and in reality she had long straight hair and facial features untypical of Negroes. For example, she had a hook nose instead of a flat nose, as well as smaller sized lips. What is more, we have the mummy of King Tut's grandfather, whose name was Yuya. He was clearly not a Negro, but instead had straight hair, smaller lips, and a hook nose. This mummy evidence clearly refutes the lie the ancient Egyptians were Negro. Of relevance also is the ancient Egyptian statue of Queen Nefertiti, known as the Nefertiti bust, created in 1345 BC. Egyptologist Frank Yurko explains this as, quote, the well-known head of Nefertiti in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. There she is depicted with a blue cap-like crown and with light-colored skin. The color on the statue head is ancient, as originally applied by the sculptor, in whose studio the head was excavated. So this is how Nefertiti was actually represented in ancient times, end quote. Now, when this statue is compared to the average Negro today, or ancient depictions of Cushite or Nubian Negroes, there's a major difference. Clearly Nefertiti was not a Negro. We also have the Ka statue of Hor I, who was the Egyptian pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, reigning from 1777 BC until 1775 BC. He has non-Negroid features such as blue eyes, a small nose, and small lips. Thus, the argument that Moses and Jesus must have been Negro because the ancient Egyptians were allegedly Negro is refuted by the evidence. Now yes, from 760 BC to 656 BC, Egypt was temporarily ruled by 6 Cushite or Negro pharaohs in succession. This is called the 25th dynasty, or the Cushite dynasty. As Edwin Yamauchi notes, for half a century a Cushite dynasty, the 25th, ruled Egypt. The most important ruler of this dynasty was Taharqa. W. Y. Adams comments, Taharqa was the next to last Ethiopian pharaoh. These Negro rulers came from the Nubian kingdom of Kush after its king, King Kashta, invaded Egypt and took control. These 6 Negro pharaohs did not come from Egypt, so it is erroneous to point to them and claim all native Egyptians were Negro. This Negro 25th dynasty was violently toppled and deposed by the Assyrians in 656 BC, and control of Egypt was then handed back to the native Egyptians. The last of the 6 Negro pharaohs, Tantamani, fled back to Nubia after this Assyrian toppling. Egyptologist Edna N. Russman notes concerning these temporary Negro pharaohs, quote, "The newcomers did not look like Egyptians. Their skin was darker, their physiognomy that of the Sudan," end quote. Yamauchi adds, "The Kushite rulers are depicted with darker chocolate-brown color than the reddish-brown Egyptians in the wall paintings of the Temple of Taharqa at Qasr Ibrim, and also on a papyrus fragment. The confusion arises among fake black Israelites of today because they see ancient art and statues of these 6 temporary Negro foreign rulers, or general artwork of Negroes who were a small minority in ancient Egypt, and then they falsely conclude that all ancient Egyptians must have been Negro. However, as we've demonstrated, this is incorrect. The ancient Egyptian word for their land was Kemet, which means the black. Fake black Israelites claim this is because the skin color of the ancient Egyptians was allegedly black. However, Egyptologist Herman Keyes notes, the black, fertile soil gave Egypt its name Kemet, the black. The word does not have anything to do with skin color. Likewise, Professor of Old Testament Robert A. Bennett confirms, Egypt referred to herself as the Black Land, Keme, alluding to the rich mud from the Nile inundations. The ever-encroaching desert was called the Red Land, Dashre, end quote. Another way fake black Israelites try to show the ancient Egyptians were Negro is they appeal to the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC. In his work, The History of Herodotus, he says people called the Colchians were Egyptians. Colchians were people who lived in what today is the country Georgia. Then fake black Israelites argue Herodotus described the Colchians as Negroes. Herodotus wrote, "For the people of Colchis are evidently Egyptian, and this I perceived for myself before I hear it from others. They are dark-skinned and have curly hair. This of itself amounts to nothing, for there are other races which are so, but also still more because the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians alone, of all the races of men, have practiced circumcision from the first." However, Herodotus was not the most reliable when it came to his descriptions of other people's ethnic features. Consider his inaccurate claim that the semen of Indians and Ethiopians was black, like the color of their skin. Secondly, he was probably not even describing Colchians as Negroes. As historian of ancient Egypt, Simpson Najovitz observes, had Herodotus wanted to designate the Colchians as blacks, and by extension designate the Egyptians as blacks, he would have named the Colchians by the standard Greek term Aetho and Aethiops, scorched faces, Ethiopians. This is precisely what he did on several other occasions when he wanted to indicate that a people was of the black race, or what he thought was the black race. But not only did not he name the Colchians as Aethiops, Ethiopians, in the same sentence he once again distinguished between Egyptians and Ethiopians. In another quote from the same work, Herodotus refutes the idea the Nile River rose because of melting snow. He notes the Nile begins in places like modern Libya and Ethiopia, which are extremely hot, and then it travels to Egypt, and thus snow could not exist in hot places where the Nile originates. Fake black Israelites falsely claim he describes Egyptians as Negro here. Herodotus wrote, "This way has no more truth in it than the rest, alleging as it does that the Nile flows from melting snow, whereas it flows out of Libya through the midst of the Ethiopians, and so comes out into Egypt. How then should it flow from snow when it flows from the hottest parts to those which are cooler, the people dwelling there, who are of a black color by reason of the burning heat?" On this quote, fake black Israelites are incorrect. It is clear that here Herodotus is describing the Libyans and Ethiopians as being black from the burning heat, since they are from the area where the Nile flows from. That is the area where it would be impossible for snow to form, the Nile River. He's not talking about Egypt, since the Nile does not flow from there, but instead, as he says, the Nile starts where it is burning hot, that is Libya and Ethiopia, and then travels to where it is cooler,